So before there was Indian, there was Victory, and Harley-Davidson wasn't the only twin cam engine on the block. Victory had their 106, which they were coming after Harley-Davidson's twin cam motor with. Now both of these engines were technically twin cam motors, but they both went about it very differently. The only thing is that Victory lacked one thing that they couldn't topple Harley-Davidson with that Victory 106 motor. Now, I gotta admit, the Victory 106 was an excellent engine. It had a lot of nice technology in it, but as I mentioned, it did lack one thing that the Harley-Davidson engines had, that basically the Victory motor was never going to have just because of its design. But all in all, it was an excellent engine. It used a single pin crank. It was a solid one-piece crank that actually ran on the plain automotive style bearings. Now, in doing that, they had to offset the cylinders. Before we get too far into the video today, please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. The engine itself had a 50-degree V-angle, which was very nice. It looked pretty good, a little different. And we'll also look at why they had that 50-degree V-angle as well. But as I mentioned, the cylinders were offset because of the one-piece plain bearing crank. Now, the Harleys, on the other hand, they still use the three-piece press crankshaft assembly, the knife and fork, which this allows Harley-Davidson to run their cylinders in line. This creates some issues of its own with having them pressed, but for the most part, the Harley cranks do decently well as long as you don't get too crazy with them. And as we all know with the twin cam, they still had the roller bearings, so no plain bearing bottom end, and basically worst of all, they had done away with that Timken bottom end after the 2002 model year. Now 2007, for the twin cam 96, the 103, and the 110, everything became fuel injected. Well, these engines were originally designed as carbureted motors. Now, what Harley did is they basically added the throttle body, the intake throat, and they put port injection in it. And this is very important. Now, on the Victory, they went with the 50-degree V-angle, where they did have their advantages with that was they were able to put the throttle bodies on top between the cylinders in kind of a downdraft fashion. Now, this is one thing about the Victory engine that I really didn't care for, was that they were basically direct injected. Now, direct injection can cause a lot of issues. Now, in having basically the downdraft direct injection setup, Polaris was able to put their air box mounted on top of the engine and draw air in from the front of the engine, which means a cooler air charge. So, don't get me wrong, the Victories did produce quite a bit of power and quite a bit of torque. Just maybe not as much as they'd advertised, and we're going to take a look at that later in the video. Now, while direct injection is really good for horsepower and fuel economy, it does have its drawbacks in the fact that when you have fuel being directly injected into the cylinder, you don't have any way of cleaning your intake valves. Now, the issue with this is you're still getting the EPA mandated crankcase ventilation through the air intake, and you're pulling in this hot, oily, oxygen depleted air, and you're pulling all this in across your intake valves. All that oil and everything over time collects on your intake valve, and this is where Harley really had the advantage with the port injection. Since the port injection, the fuel is actually injected into the intake tract, the gasoline actually cleans the intake valve as it passes over into the cylinders. So there's nothing wrong with port injection, it's just not quite as good for horsepower and for fuel economy as a direct injection. I think I would take being able to keep my intake valves clean over some of the issues that can come with fouling out your intake valves associated with direct injection. Now, I know we're really kind of comparing apples to oranges here. With the Victory was actually a overhead cam motor. It was a single overhead cam motor, so you had one cam per cylinder, but they used a 4-valve head. Now, the twin cam had 2 cams basically within the block, push rod actuated, with 2 valves per cylinder. Now on Harleys, the valve adjustments were taken up by the hydraulic lifters. Kind of the same concept with the overhead cams on the Victory. Now, Victory kind of messed with our minds as far as terminology goes. Looking at some of the literature on these, they would actually, in some cases, call these little hydraulic actuated pucks that were on top of the valves, basically operated by, that were in the rocker arms, they would call these lifters. Well, they weren't really lifters. They were more referred to as hydraulic pucks. But what they did was they took care of all your valve operation, so you never really had to adjust the valves with that overhead cam engine either. Now, being an overhead cam engine, the camshafts were driven off the crankshaft, and in some rights, the Victory engine was designed to be somewhat simpler than the Harley-Davidson. They had something like 12 total gaskets throughout the whole engine, as where your typical twin cam engine has about 65 gaskets throughout the entire motor. So a little bit more simplicity there, but that also means they're a lot tighter fitting motors, and you don't have as much slack and slop as you would with the twin cam. Now, as far as the engine design itself, once again, Polaris and the Victory motor, they went with a unitized design, which means your engine, transmission, everything is all housed within the same case. And by doing so, they also went with obviously having it all in the same case, they went with a gear-driven primary. Now, Harley-Davidson still used the divorced engine and transmission, and they stuck with their good old, proven, tried and true, old school, chain-driven primary setup. Now, both setups really do have their advantage. Having everything in a unitized transmission, you really only have to run one fluid for the entire engine setup. Now, with Harley-Davidson, you have your engine oil, of course. Now, with your primary, you do have options there. You can run 2050 synthetic oil, or you can run a dedicated primary fluid. Same thing with the transmission. You can run 2050 synthetic motor oil, or you can run a gear oil. But the one good thing about on the Victory motor, even though everything shares the same fluid, it does all run through the filter, which whether that's good or bad. Personally, I like the Harley design where everything's completely separated. Now, all the twin cam motors that were around in the Victory era, including the Victory, they all ran the 6-speed transmission. Now, if you know anything about Victories, you know back in the day, they had some really rough transmissions. I remember the first Victory I heard, it was probably about a 99 2000 model. Those transmissions clanked and banged, and they were really hard to find neutral with. Well, around 2011, they went in, they redesigned the transmissions, they set them up with about 66% less backlash. So basically they loosened the tolerances in them a bit, and they also put in basically a positive neutral, where when you're sitting still and you basically pull up, it goes straight into neutral and it won't go into second gear if you're sitting still. Kind of like Kawasaki's positive neutral finder feature. Now, with Victory engines, they did have two different 106 motors. They had basically the stage 1 engine that went into their baggers. Now, their bagger motor, their claim power was 92 horsepower and roughly about 109 foot-pounds of torque. And then Victory had their hotter engine, which went into a lot of their muscle cruisers, which they called the stage 2 engine. It had a little bit better set of cams in it. They claimed this one to put down about 97 horsepower and roughly about 113 foot-pounds of torque. But in actuality, on the dyno, you were looking at about roughly 85 horsepower and 100 foot-pounds of torque. So really no surprise there from an overhead cam engine. Now, as far as Harley-Davidsons go, on the 96, we were looking at about 65 horsepower and right around 80 foot-pounds of torque. And with the 103, we were getting about 70 horsepower and roughly in the neighborhood about 85 foot-pounds of torque. And for you 110 guys, I know you guys always feel left out. I'm not leaving you out on this. You were getting about 80 horsepower and right around 100 foot-pounds of torque with those motors. So the new Indians, they really don't share a lot with the Victory other than being a unitized design, gear-driven primary, but the Indian engine is pretty much all different compared to what the Victory was. So what exactly killed Victory? Well, 3 of the last 5 years of production, Victory just was not profitable. They were making no money. Basically came down to the Indian brand was supporting them. And don't get me wrong, Victory was something different. They were a very modern take on the classic American V-twin. They had some different styling designs that even consequently, I saw Harley. They were looking over Victory's shoulder, looking at their bikes. Some of that design made it into the Harley-Davidsons, not in the engine, of course. So what really held Victory back from overtaking Harley-Davidson? Of course, this is just my speculation, but it was the sound. You're just not going to get that sound that the Harley-Davidson makes. Now, granted, the fuel-injected bikes, they sound nothing like the old twin-cam carbureted bikes or even the Evo carbureted bikes. While Victory was a different sound, it just wasn't that to the dump sound that the Harleys made that you would normally associate with a bagger or a cruiser, anything that kind of, I don't want to say looked like a Harley-Davidson, but that's generally who everybody copies, including the metric manufacturers. But anyhow, guys, that is all I've got for you this week. I really appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed a little look into the Victory engine and kind of how it really compared to the twin cam at the time. There really wasn't any comparison. They were two completely different engine designs, and yeah, the Victory may have put out a little more horsepower and torque, but at the end of the day, I just feel like what killed is it just didn't have that sound of the Harley, and then Indian came along, and yeah, the rest is pretty much history there. But anyhow, guys, if you enjoyed the video today, please don't forget to hit that like button. Leave a comment. We have one of the best comment sections on YouTube. I really enjoy reading everybody's conversations there. But anyhow, guys, you guys stay safe on the streets, dodge the cars, and I'll catch you guys back here next week with a brand new video. Thanks for watching.